And welcome to our talk. My name is Josh Stone, and this is Patrick Fussell. We are penetration testers for a company called PSC. We mostly do PCI assessments, though occasionally we do dip into other contexts. And today we're talking about penetration testing. Penetration testing has a lot of different contexts and shades of meaning these days. Usually if you look at most industry methodologies, or if you take a class, you'll find that penetration testing looks something like this. We have some sort of identification of the resources that are available to us. We try to see if there are vulnerabilities there. We're going to exploit those and see where it leads us. Unfortunately, and something I feel like we have to mention here, is that there are lots of situations in our industry now where a penetration test looks a little bit more like this. And it's a good service, it's good to find vulnerabilities and verify that they're true, but it's not really a penetration test. What we're talking about in penetration testing, and especially in a compliance-focused pen test like a PCI scenario, we're talking about a situation where there is some identifiable objective. There's a success criteria that allows us to answer an important question with the pen test. So in our case, when we're doing PCI pen tests, the question is the cardholder data safe if somebody intrudes and breaches the internal network? So if we don't get hold of the cardholder data or access the environment that processes it, then even if we hacked some stuff, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem as far as the PCI data. And it turns out in most real networks, there's something to hack somewhere. And the big question that's actually valuable is, can someone do something damaging? The things that we're most concerned about, are they at risk in an intrusion? So along that vein, what we're talking about today is more of examples from the trenches, as it were. Several scenarios from real pen tests, or aggregated examples from multiple real pen tests, to highlight some strategies that we use in that process. It's not just about going through your 5 phases of pen testing and write a report. The point is you keep going within the time that you have available to find that success criteria and get those crown jewels. So what we're not talking about today, we're not talking about 0 days. We're going to have some spectacular vulnerability. We're not even really talking about the tools. What we're talking about is the strategy or the technique and the mental approach that we're using to work our way through a big network. This should be relevant to you if you're a pen tester, or also if you're a defender. Because from the defense point of view, what I find is a lot of the things that really pan out for us, especially if you're doing your patching and vulnerability scanning and other sort of hygienic processes in your network, there's still all this other stuff that's useful to a pen tester that kind of never really gets fixed. And you're disclosing lots of information that we can use that turns out quite handy. So I'll hop into the first scenario. That one Patrick will do. So I'll hand it over.
All right, hopefully this isn't too far away. That sound okay?
Yeah.
All right, so there are what I think of dozens of ways that you might frame a pen test, or if you were to go Google pen test methodologies, you get quite a few results. I think one of the things that and Josh sort of put in this a little bit is that these make the pen testing process seem very linear. You execute something, you finish with it, and you move on. I think that the problem with this is that in reality, that things that you do in a pen test tend to repeat themselves, or they're very organic to the situation. So, for example, one of the first things you might see in any methodology involves scanning and enumeration, right? So you're using nmap or masscan or resolving DNS names or something. This might be something that you do once, but more than likely it's something you're going to do during maybe the exploitation, even post-exploitation, as you continue to build a picture of the network. And just for example, maybe as you begin the pen test, you do run some sort of initial scanning, get a feel for what can I see or where am I. It might be something that's kind of ambiguous. You're in a user network and there's a server network somewhere, but you don't really know. As the pen test progresses, that might break down. So you start to see where certain users are assigned to certain segments or something along those lines. Get a much better feel for what goes where. So one of the things you really want to do is sort of pull some of that information together to get a better feel for how you might use it during the pen test. So remote desktop is one of the services I think that's fairly ubiquitous in a Windows network. And it's fairly ubiquitous in a Windows network, but one of the things you might notice, or you might not realize initially about remote desktop is it actually can have some information that's fairly useful to you. So if your user's already connected to the session and you connect to it as well, you'll see that when you log into it, you might see their Active Directory domain name, you might see their username. So keep that in mind for just a second. Another piece of information that we might see as we start a pen test is domain names, right? DNS can give us a really good feel for what's on the network. The naming convention might be very descriptive. So you might see things like DC1 or DC2, maybe SQL database server 1. So it gives you a feel for what are these systems and what do they do. But another thing we might see is that users might be associated with specific systems, right? And when we resolve these names, we can tell, okay, these hosts are sitting in specific places and they belong to these users. But as we go back and take a look at the remote desktop session, remote desktop might not be a great place to log into 100 different sessions and try to collect usernames. But if we put it together with the DNS names, now we have a feel for what is the actual username convention, and we can do a little cut and grep, and now we have a user list that we can use to do something like build a password-based attack against Active Directory.
It's worth noting too, if you think about it, there's no using of null sessions on the domain controller. We don't have to find that there's no authentication for the intranet or something like that so we can find usernames. These kinds of information disclosures are quite fun. And for this scenario, we move into the second example, which is we've now gotten that list of usernames and we check just to see if anybody has a bad password. And you might think, well, if it's a small network, I mean, who's going to have password one with a capital P? But actually, as your user population tends to infinity, you definitely have somebody somewhere with a password of password one. And so here in this example, we've gotten the password for Joe Schmo. And as we might expect, looking at the name, we're thinking, it's really unlikely that Joe Schmo is an interesting user, but at least it's something. So we can check against the domain and find out what kind of user is he. Well, Joe Schmo is only in the domain users group. And this is one of those cases where a lot of times, if I was talking to the client, they would say, well, all you have is a regular user. That's not very powerful. They can't do anything in our network. No administrative rights, nothing. But as a pen tester, where are we in the pen test? And the question we have to ask ourselves most importantly is, what does domain users actually get us? What value is there in this user? And I want to borrow a concept that I ran into in a presentation by Halvar Flake a couple of years ago. He talked about the compromise boundary. And the compromise boundary for a hacker is the set of all the things that you control, or the things you could control, given what you have. And what we've done in the pen test is we've found an initial entry point, and we've gone now from nothing to something. And something isn't everything, but it's still a lot closer than where we were. Right, so even though we really wish Joe Schmo was a schema admin, because that would be awesome, the fact that he doesn't control systems is sad, but he actually has access to a lot of things in the domain. And the thing we're going to focus on right now is files. When you look at a typical network, there are lots of files, but some files are much more interesting than other ones. Here are a couple examples of some files that have credentials embedded in them. And then there would be other examples of interesting files. I've had 2 occasions in the last couple of years where I actually found VMware disk images that were on an open share, not an open share, but a share that an authenticated user could access. And from there I can extract password hashes. There are all kinds of wonderful things that you find in the file environment in your typical corporate network. And so I'm going to be particularly interested in finding out what Joe Schmo has access to. So in a typical small environment, and maybe we've got a few tens of users or something like that, there are only about thousands of files to think about. This is something I can go through probably in an afternoon. It might take me a couple hours to go through all their shares and see what Joe Schmo has access to, and that's no big deal. But as we scale this to a true enterprise, where we've got tens of thousands or more users, this becomes a very intractable problem for the pen tester. We're not talking about thousands of files, we're probably talking about thousands of shares. And each of those could have thousands of files. And I just don't have the time to go through millions of files to find that one that's cool. So how am I going to do this? I can't use manual techniques. I can't grab a Windows box and map a share. Clicking through there will absolutely kill me. And then there are some other options, other SMB clients, and those work fine. The SMB client tool that comes with Samba has a recursive feature, so I could, in principle, spider the shares with that or something, get back a good body of information. It's inconvenient, though, because the recursion behavior and the way SMB client does that is inconvenient for me. It'll get bogged down in these ginormous shares. It'll get stuck on a backup share or something that has a billion DAT files, and it'll just never come back. So I'm not the only guy who's ever done this, but I put together a tool some years ago called Plunder because I was just so frustrated with only being able to look at a few shares and knowing there's all this stuff out there that I haven't already gotten. So I'll walk you through what this looks like. But focus not so much on the tool, but focus on the idea. First, we scan the network. We find ourselves a bunch of SMB servers. Formulate that as an input to Plunder. It just takes SMB URLs as input, and it'll perform whatever action we instruct it to given that input. And then we run Plunder against a whole lot of systems. This is an example running against about 700 different shares with 5 threads. If I run it with 30 threads, I've successfully indexed networks as large as like 18 million files. I get the Joe Schmo user, and in a couple hours I can get a list of all 18 million files that he can get to. And that body of information is tremendously useful because what was a manual process is now a tractable post-analysis situation. So a typical result would be something like this. I get a whole bunch of files back, just lists of all the files you can access, and I got over 300 web.config files. Everybody know what's in a web.config file? What are the odds that at least one of these 300 files has a database credential that's probably going to be SA, or maybe it has a service account for Active Directory or something like that? But what's fun is now I've scaled up and gotten the information about the files I have access to, but I still have a difficult problem, and that is it could take me all day to download 300 web.config files and look through them. So Plunder also has a download and mirroring capability so that I can take that list of SMB URLs that I got from the spider scan and run it right back through and have it download. It'll create a local directory tree that mirrors the network file system and pull all those files down for me, and I can just use a recursive CREP. Find me the credentials. So before you think, well, that's kind of, my network wouldn't ever have that problem. The fact is, every network I've ever been to, except for 2, I found something that I shouldn't have had access to on the file share. It might be this situation where I've got an unprivileged user and I can escalate my privileges, or it might even be a case where I've got an administrative user and I can get information that leads me outside the domain. So I can get access to the network devices, or I can get access to the Unix environment, or the mainframe, or something like that. And this turns out to be a tremendously valuable strategy for pulling this information out of the network when I've only got a week. So with that, we'll hop into scenario number 3.
All right. So I think in probably most goal-based pen tests, or in particular in a PCI pen test, we have this concept of sort of a low security network and a high security network. And typically we expect that we're going to execute the pen test from the perspective of the lower security network and trying to gain access to that higher security segment. They can take lots of different forms. I think this scales out to different ways of doing this. However, I think our most commonly we see that this is a network segmentation boundary. Somewhere along the line we're preventing traffic from traversing the 2 segments. And now, sometimes you might see that there's maybe a handful of services, maybe there's an application exposed, but I think more commonly we tend to think of this as a strict segmentation boundary where there should be no services traveling directly between the 2. However, we know that somebody in this lower security network is probably accessing the high security network. Maybe it's somebody who's accessing the application, or it's people who are administering the network. At some point, somebody's moving between the two. They're probably not walking their laptop over to a different network every time they need to do something. One thing to keep in mind, especially as a network tends to grow in size, when we have these strict segmentation boundaries, something that's going to sort of naturally evolve from that is the increase in the complexity of administrating the network. Because we have to interact with it in different ways, we have to think about how are we going to make changes to those systems and make sure that they're up to date or whatever the particular challenge is. So what happens is you may start with something that looks like this, and you have in theory a secure network, but what it ends up looking like is something more like this. So we poke holes that start off as something temporary, they end up being permanent, and then you forget about them, and they stay around forever. So in this scenario, what we're thinking about is we've already done our scanning and enumeration. We gained some initial access to the network already. We found an uncoupled user, then we found some DA creds like Josh was sort of alluding to. So now we have a domain administrator access to our network. The question becomes, what's the next step? How do we move from this low security place to the high security place? So we want for a PCI Pentest, we're talking about the cardholder data environment as our high security network. So what do we want to do? We want to find a way into that cardholder data environment. One really great tool for accomplishing this is your netstat. On just about any system, netstat is essentially just looking for what are the connections to and from any particular host, right? Now I'll go ahead and point out one really great way to gain this information or gather this across a range of hosts is Josh's Route Hunter tool. Essentially all this does is grabs netstats from a select list of systems for you. You give it the target IPs and some credentials, and it dumps the data for you. So now you have netstats from everybody on the network or everybody on your local, or directly accessible to you with your credentials. So what can we do with this information? Well, probably one of the most obvious things is we can just grep for a network range. Maybe we know that a target range is what we're really looking for. A quick grep will say, oh, look, there's some direct connections that we can reuse. Maybe it's something we can use by mature pivot, or maybe it's something that requires a more advanced exploitation, but we have an idea of where to start at least. But what if we don't see any of these direct connections? This data can still be incredibly useful to you, and what I want to touch on real quickly is a way to go over it. Another handy little script that Josh wrote involves taking these netstats and using Graphiz, which is essentially just a visualization tool to actually visualize all the network connections. So what the Joshua script does is it will turn the netstats into a dot file. So this is basically just a textual description. And we execute a command and it draws a nice picture for us. So one of the first things I think that you can use or look at when you generate one of these is let's look for anywhere where we see maybe a ton of connections coming into a particular host. This might be something as simple as a file server or a database, but maybe it's something like a jump box that we didn't know about before. In particular, I think this is useful when you look at these connections and you see something that you didn't know about before. Maybe it's something that the IT team or the network team didn't tell you about, doesn't know about, or doesn't want you to know about. Maybe it's a subnet that you didn't see before. But if we see a bunch of connections coming into a single host and it's a subnet we've never seen before, particularly it may be very interesting. The great thing about Route Hunter is that it can quickly gather this information. I've had an engagement this year where we're able to cover about 3,100 hosts in under 9 minutes. So you can run this a couple of times throughout the course of the engagement and get a really great picture of the network and get a feel for who should be going to where and what should that look like. And when we can spot these outliers, it might tell us, hey, look, there's the jump box that the customer forgot to tell you about that they forgot to configure MFA for, and now you've got your point of exploit.
was saying, with Route Hunter, but once you've parked yourself with domain admin on a network, just run something like that every 30 minutes or every hour for a day, and you'll see the behavior of the network over time. And I'm convinced that what we're talking about, we're doing the first layer of analysis on that stuff. The material you can pull out of analyzing a big data set like that, if you can get it, is wonderful. Going into the next scenario, this is a little bit different. This is not a PCI example, but in this case it's a penetration test against a product company that's concerned about people leaking information about their new products. So instead of looking for a PCI cardholder data environment, I'm looking for instead information about those new unreleased products. This is different because segmentation really should be very different in this case. Most places aren't going to have a PCI style CDE for protecting their product data. But it turned out this one was actually quite challenging for me, and my initial strategy going in didn't pan out. So I don't know about you, but I tend to overly romanticize what I do for a living. It makes it a lot more fun. I typically think of your typical company as being kind of like a medieval kingdom. You've got a nested hierarchy of enclaves and different silos that have complex political relationships. You've got, if you look at an org chart, it's basically a system of feudal vassals and lords, which makes it a lot more fun to just think about it that way. I figured in this case, once I got the keys to the kingdom, domain admin, I should be able, I have the run of the kingdom, so I can just go to all the places and find the little hamlets and burgs where they're making this information about unreleased products. And it turned out it defied my ability to find them. I had gone through the shares, I had gone through Active Directory, and I'm getting to the end of the pen test. It's the 11th hour, and I don't have anything. I have stuff about current products, but nothing that meets the success criteria. I haven't gotten to the goal. So I start kind of flailing around. I'm trying all my Statue of Liberty plays, and Hail Marys and so forth, and just thinking, great, I'm gonna end up with domain admin in a non-segmented network, and I'm not gonna have the success criteria met. So I'm going back through my notes and thinking, well, what do I have? Because at any point in pen test, to me, if you're to boil the entire process of pen testing down to one thing, it's that I think, what do I have? Where do I want to be? Does anything I have get me there or closer to there? And so I'm just going through the things I had done so far. And one of the quirky little scans I had done for some reason was to collect a listing of all the services running on all the systems in the domain. I think at the time I was probably looking for antivirus suites or checking consistency of implementation for some defensive tool that they had in the environment. But I started thinking through, and I thought, if I was on a team that makes information about new products, maybe I'm a product designer, I'm an engineer or something like that, I bet I have some special software that everybody doesn't get. And I know, for example, with Visual Studio, a lot of times you'll see a couple services associated with Visual Studio. I often use that to find developers so that I can target them. And I thought, well, I wonder in this case, maybe the same thing might work. So I had this body of knowledge, and I started exploring it a little bit. What's kind of fun about services, there are some services like the browser service that are actually running on all computers. Every Windows box has the browser service running. So that's not a very useful service for me. It's not going to help me identify a special group that's different from the others. But then if you go to the other extreme, I've got something like 700 services that are running on only a single machine. And that's overly discriminating. That just tells me who has a weird network card or who has the one decent NVIDIA card or something. And so that's not going to help me so much. What I'm particularly curious about is anything in this zone where I see it's between 5 and 20 machines that have this service. That's about the size to be of a team or maybe a small department or something like that. So I start looking through the data, and as I'm going down, I see that there are 12 systems that have the SolidWorks licensing service installed. And how many people here recognize SolidWorks and know what SolidWorks is? Okay, cool, we got one. Yeah, maybe this wouldn't show up to everybody immediately, but I was an administrator in a mechanical engineering department once, and I know exactly what SolidWorks is. SolidWorks is a CAD package. It's a nice one. It's an expensive one. I wish I had one because I also have a 3D printer, and that would be nice. But anyway, I started thinking, well, I bet I bet SolidWorks is for people who are making the mechanical drawings and so forth for these new products. And so these are the CAD designers' workstations. And then as I started to explore their boxes, I realized why I could never find this information on the file shares. It's because these CAD designers don't use the file shares. They store everything on their local disk. I usually exclude C drives when I'm spidering shares because they're generally uninteresting. But by following this path, I was able to find the information about unreleased products, and there I have my success criteria. This was a very fun and interesting pen test to me. It was the first time I'd had this kind of intuitive leap in this manner at this point. But what I realized is that this is actually something that, as a strategic move, is something I now use all the time. What I'm interested in is any system that's not like other systems is more interesting to me. There's some set of baseline boxes that are all about the same, and those are useless. And in a big network, there might be thousands or tens of thousands of uninteresting machines. And if I can find distinctive characteristics that help me figure out which ones are different, and I can collect that information efficiently, then I'm able to narrow my focus in my limited time for the pen test and get to where I can answer the useful question. So once you see this one time, you start to see it everywhere, and there are situations that come up, like, I'm interested in finding people that might have dual-homed machines. You can get this information a few different ways, but if you can list the interfaces on all systems and pull that information together, you spot interesting things. You also find anyone that has VMware installed because they have a few extra network interfaces. You see anybody that has weird VPN clients configured because each of those will have their own little virtual interface. It's actually this really interesting body of data. Or what if I can get a task listing, list the processes on all the systems in the domain and pull that together in one body of knowledge? That ends up being tremendously useful because I can see all the people who have the terminal client for the mainframe or something like that running. These things help me to narrow down my focus and concentrate on those groups of systems that are special and unique. And then another quick example, I had a situation not too long ago where I had about 6,000 users in the environment sitting on the network, and some of them can VPN into the CDE. Well, I'm interested to know which ones can, and there is no Active Directory group that just tells me these are the CDE VPNers. And so I'm looking at the endpoint for the VPN, and I realize, oh, it's a Cisco VPN. Maybe if I just collect a listing from program files from all of the systems in the domain, I can tell who has the Cisco AnyConnect client installed. I took 6,000 users and winnowed that down to 180-ish users or something like that, and that's tractable. I can't park keyloggers and man-in-the-middle agents and other fun malware things on 6,000 boxes responsibly. But I can go after 180. That's quite doable. So starting to think about what information can I collect and post-process to focus my death ray, whatever we're doing in pen test, turns out to be a wonderful and very profitable strategy. So for Scenario 5, we're not handing off. I get 2 in a row. Scenario 5 is also a little bit different. We've already got domain admin, and we're trying to get our access to the cardholder data environment. But in this case, I actually know exactly where it is. I know where the crown jewels are. They're sitting in that locked box over there. And the problem is when I try to access it, I come up against a challenging barrier. So here, when I was a younger pen tester, I always would just throw my hands up and say, okay, you win, and you've got a good network. I hate that MFA. And over time, it just it sticks. You think, there ought to be something I can do. And so last year at DerbyCon, I had the opportunity to present a few strategies we use to get around multi-factor. And even a heavily protected environment, we should expect there should always be at least something we can do. So today, I'm not going to talk about the bypasses I did last year, and this one's a different one. And in fact, this one is one that to me, it kind of fits into the so silly I can't believe it works. But in fact, it's so easy to do, and it works so often, I go to this one first now. And in fact, this month, I've had 2 pen tests in a row where I use this exact technique to get access to the cardholder data environment. So to understand where this comes from, there's a particular vulnerability that I'm leveraging here. And it all comes down to Bob. So this is Bob. He's the regular, average Mark I corporate user. Okay, he lives in the cube farm with all of the other denizens and works out his day, whatever his role is. And the big problem with Bob's day is that he is absolutely ruled by a harsh and unforgiving task mistress. And that is his calendar. Typically, most environments would not consider the calendar to be a vulnerability, but this gets kind of fun once you do it. You see, in Bob's day, he's got a bunch of meetings that clog it up. As far as he's concerned, most of those just use up an inordinate amount of time and keep him from getting work done. It's not all bad because sometimes he gets to go out to eat, and then there are those opportunities to get up and walk around the office a bit, head to the water cooler, make a coffee run, commiserate with the other inmates, and then of course nature calls on occasion for a little solitude and contemplation. And really, when you get down to it, the fact is, for much of the day, Bob's computer looks kind of like this. And that isn't so interesting. I see computers like this all the time, but sometimes this is very special because behind this screen, Bob has a remote desktop session that's already multi-factor authenticated in the cardholder data environment. And because it's so annoying to multi-factor every time that screen locks, it doesn't multi-factor when he unlocks that one. So if I could only know when this situation occurs, maybe I could take advantage of that session. So I started thinking to myself, if I could wait until Bob goes to the CDE and then tell when he locks his screen, I already know his password, so I could remote desktop into his box and then just use it. It's kind of the dumbest hack ever, but if I could get the right situation, then I'd come off looking like a rock star. And someone would look at it and say, well, how on earth did you ever find that situation? And it turns out that this is really cool in theory, but in practice it can be kind of difficult. In a small network, there are only so many people who access the target zone. And then the other problem is some people are kind of fastidious, and they close their windows before they lock and go to lunch and whatever. So in a typical small environment, this is kind of hard to pull off. You have to wait potentially for a long time for the right situation to occur. And I can't bill the customer for pen testing where I'm just waiting for something to happen. Got to do something. Thanks, Joe. But there's this interesting thing that happens with scale. In the animal kingdom, it's good to be in a herd, right? If you're a wildebeest, you don't want to be alone. You want to be in a whole big group of wildebeests because you're relatively safer from the predator. The network is the opposite, though. The bigger the network gets, the more at risk it is because only one of those wildebeests has to get caught, and the attacker gets what he wants. Right? I'm not the herd. I'm the predator in this situation. When the network gets big, there aren't just a handful of users that can get to this place. You don't really get big by having only 2 people who work at your cardholder data environment, right? So there are probably many, many targets, could even be thousands depending on the situation. Maybe you've got call centers and everybody connects to Jumpbox and whatever. And so there's this interesting thing that happens with scale. What we're doing is we're calculating the set intersection of a bunch of groups of people. We start with the entire environment. Some of them can get to the CDE. Some of them are right now in the CDE. And then some of those might lock their screen. In the small environment, the number of people in that black shaded zone is probably small. It's probably about 0 on average. But in a big network, it becomes non-zero on average, which means at any given time, there's probably one of these sitting out there somewhere. Now, the only challenge here, especially given what we've talked about so far, is finding people with screens locked. If you look on Google, you'll find that Stack Overflow suggests you write an executable that calls this Win32 API function, and you get back a struct, and it gets populated with some flag that tells you if the screen is locked. And I don't necessarily want to throw an executable out to all 6,000 boxes. I have to put that list in the report, right? So I've got a few things that make me say that's hard. That's not the easy way to do it. And actually, there are probably 100 different ways to get this information, but I just wanted to find an easier one. And the easier one that I stumbled on is when Windows locks the screen, it runs a program called logonui.exe. As we already talked about, with Route Hunter, I can get netstats, but I can also just run a command and get the result back. I can get a task list from all the systems in the domain in about 10 minutes. and I can have this list. So now we have everything that we need. Patrick talked about NetStat whispering in order to get people who talk to the CDE. We can find the lock screens by checking for logonui.exe. We can use the super elite hacking tool called CREP to figure out which ones are in those lists, and then any remote desktop client works. So you see, this is basically exploit-free hacking. There's nothing going, I'm using admin rights to do a thing an admin can do, and then remote desktoping somewhere. So at any given time during the assessment, I can run 2 scans and a grep, and I get a list of all of the points where I can get to the CDE right now. Now there are some caveats. There are things that can go wrong, things you have to account for. It might depend on what they're using to access the CDE or whatever. We can chat about some of the details if you want to afterwards, grab me. The biggest one, though, was a substantial concern for me initially, because I thought, well, what if Baby Bear gets back from the bathroom and figures out that somebody's been sleeping in his bed? The mouse is moving. Well, you wouldn't see that because he'll see the lock screen, but he sees that his windows are rearranged, and I was in the middle of typing some awesome command, some big PowerShell one-liner, and he caught me. I thought, well, that's got to be a serious risk, right? But it turns out that in reality, it's not that big of a deal, because the first thing I saw when I remote desktop into Bob's machine was his calendar, and I can see that he's going to be trapped in that change control meeting for an hour, which means I actually have a pretty good amount of time. If it happens that I don't see any reason why he's going to be gone for a little bit, well then I'll just disconnect and wait for a better time. There were 2 others in that scan you saw a couple slides ago, and I can just wait a few minutes and see if someone else pops up. And a few minutes on this box in the CDE is probably enough for me to identify what exfiltration mechanisms I have available, find a C2 channel, install some malicious agent, and secure continuous control of that box. And that gives me access to the CDE without having to ever worry about multi-factor again. So that, scenario 6.
All right, so in this last scenario, it's something I ran into this year that had me a little bit scared, a little bit frustrated, pressed for time. I had gotten an early compromise into the sort of corporate side of the network. I've been able to get into the CDE. Actually, I had a full compromise there, so I had full control over all the machines that would typically say, this is going to give me a win, this is going to give me the data I want. Unfortunately, in searching through databases and looking through file shares, I wasn't able to actually find, this is a PCI Pentest, so I was looking for Cardholder data. I wasn't able to actually find any. The customer had some tokenization solution in place. Maybe I just wasn't looking in the right place. When time starts to press you, you think, well, maybe I need to be a little more creative with how I'm doing this, how I'm approaching it. So what I wanted to do here was take a step backwards and look at what information I had collected, what did I know about the network that I could look to figure out maybe a more pointed target or figure out where the data really would be. And one thing to point out here is that there had been some pre-engagement discussion that the customer had indicated somebody is interacting with the data that I want. So I had a strong feeling, or I was pretty certain that it was somewhere, I just didn't know where and how I was going to get to it. So in this situation, like I said, I already had control over the domain. I had interpreter shells open on a couple hundred hosts just because I was starting to really sort of open shells and look for information. But one of the things I wanted to do was start to break down those blocks a little bit more, get a feel for who was where. So what I did was I used interpreter to see who's logged on to each individual host. Then I used Overflow, which, if you don't know, is essentially just a wraparound RPC client to gather all of the group memberships and so see what users were members of what groups. And the reason I use Overflow is that it's easy to grab through. I like the output; it's pretty. And in this particular situation, the Active Directory groups were very indicative of what department the user was a member of, to give me a good feel of who was doing what. And the last piece of information that I was collecting was process lists. So sort of see, was there anything unique about groups of users or the programs that they were running? So essentially what I'm trying to do was correlate users, their groups, and the processes that they were running. So sort of an extrapolation of what Josh was describing earlier. And what I'm trying to do is break this down from something that looks like this, my understanding of the network, to something that's a little bit more detailed. And in doing this, I'll say that there was definitely some measure of desperation. You know, there were some hits and misses here trying to put together, was there something interesting? So I would target a group and find that there wasn't anything that I wanted. But one of the things I did notice was almost everybody in the organization is using Google Chrome, except for people in customer service. They all have Internet Explorer open. Now, typically Internet Explorer is not that all interesting, but I, simply because that they were unique in their use of Internet Explorer, I decided to grab a few screenshots of the running desktops, and I see that they were using Internet Explorer to open up an application that actually had some of the data I was looking for. Now, I didn't just want, you know, one piece of data that I felt like isn't necessarily a great indicator of compromise, so I wanted to expand this out a little bit further. On the recommendation of a coworker, I used the CC search tool, which will look for credit card data, PAN data. I looked through the cache files in Internet Explorer and found that Internet Explorer was indeed holding on to bits of this data for quite a bit of time. So I was able to scrape enough data that I felt like this was a much better indicator of the compromise than what I had initially come through, which was just access to the network. Because what I want to be able to represent is we are finding data that is of value to the customer, and that's the real crown jewels of the pen test. The things that Josh and I really tossed around when we first started talking about doing this talk was, what are the things that we were doing tactically, or what are the philosophical mindsets that we're using when we're running into problems? You know, I say if we just did a linear pen test, you got an exploit, you get the DA, and that's the end of the day. Maybe it would just be 1, 2, 3 steps, but I think one of the things we actually experience is that we run into challenges and things that take a little bit of creativity. And what are the things that we are doing creatively, or what are the mindsets we're using to get past some of these problems? And we mirror those to each one of these sections. And so what I want to kind of just touch on real quickly in conclusion is what are the sort of philosophical bits that we started with when we defined what these sections were supposed to mean. You know, initially talking about hiding in plain sight. And that is, when you're doing a pen test, sometimes the data that you need is already there. Sometimes you already have it in your system. You just need to take a step back and look at it to figure out, you know, how can I use it. You know, low privilege is still privilege. I feel like the philosophical driver there was don't be so set on a method of exploitation that I start with a user and he doesn't have admin privileges, you ditch it and move on. Look laterally, how can you utilize the access you already have to continue to progress the pen test? We know there are holes somewhere. I think this is almost a sort of a foundational way we think about a pen test. When you walk into a network, when you first plug in, you already know that there's going to be problems. I don't know that there is a network that the person who's administering it will tell you that it is perfect and it has no security flaws. Everybody will admit that there's some sort of flaw. The pen tester, like our job is to find those things, and you have to keep that in mind. That should be your mindset when you sit down and start. Some of these are not like the others. I feel like the takeaway or the thing that we're really driving at is being able to turn information into discrete units. So understand that, you know, a group of users is unique, or a group of systems is unique. Being able to use a data that you collected in a pen test to process that will make you much more effective in progressing. There will never be a CV for this. Josh's last section, I think this one was actually my favorite, just because I feel like when we talk about a pen test, when we talk about vulnerabilities, a lot of the time the things that we're describing, they're not, you know, exploits the way that people mean exploits when they say the word. They are architectural problems, the way that a network was designed. They're sort of inherent flaws in the way that we've divided access or tried to prevent access between places. And that when you describe a vulnerability, people say, well, that's what it was supposed to do. Well, we leverage that supposed to do into a way to get your data. And tools in unexpected places, my sort of thought process there was just that, yeah, you can get access to something, but unless you're walking away with the data that the customer thinks was part of, you know, is valuable, the thing that actually has value, have you really done the pen test? Have you really exercised, you know, what you were supposed to do? And if not, then take a step back and take a broader look at what you're trying to do to make sure that you're, you know, delivering the most value to the customer you can. Anything else?
say, how many people in here are defenders and not offenders? Yeah, a couple of these. If you're on the defensive side, I'm trying to think from this material what should be useful to the defender. And I think the biggest thing is there are so many either unrecognized assumptions or foregone conclusions about the way we build our environments. We don't realize what information is telegraphed, and sometimes we don't understand what information can be obtained. And really, if you look at a lot of the rigs that we have for collecting this information, it's spit and baling wire in a sense. You know, we're wrapping a tool up, we're collecting information from a bunch of systems, we're grepping and whatever. You guys actually have a lot of tools as the defender to know these things before we ever show up for the pen test. So I think a really good exercise on the defense is to turn introspective and think about, you know exactly where the crown jewels are, probably. Can you kind of predict what indicators or what pathways are going to be evident to an attacker and kind of nip those in the bud in advance before they would ever manifest as a problem? And I think with that, I'm going to open up for Q&A. Thanks.